The capture. The stark metallic walls of the Criol research facility loomed over the landing pad as Zerak, the facility's lead xenopsychologist, watched the approaching shuttle with barely contained excitement. His inner membranes quivered with anticipation, a reaction he hadn't experienced since his early days of species classification. The shuttle's plasma engines hummed to a stop, dispersing a fine mist of condensed atmosphere across the landing zone. This was no ordinary arrival. Inside that shuttle was the first successful capture of a member of the newly discovered species, one that had managed to achieve what only a handful of races had done before them, develop faster-than-light travel independently. While their technology was primitive by Criol standards, the very fact that they had reached the stars made them worthy of study, and potentially, worthy of integration into the Empire's carefully maintained hierarchy of servant species. Zerak's recommendation to invade their colony had been approved with surprising speed by the Imperial Council. Perhaps they, too, saw the potential he had identified in the surveillance footage. But what happened next had shocked even him. The invasion footage showed scenes that defied conventional xenological understanding. The creatures, humans, as they called themselves, fought with a ferocity that bordered on the irrational. The doors of the shuttle hissed open, revealing a containment unit flanked by 4 of the Empire's most decorated warriors. Inside, through the transparent force field walls, sat their prize, a single human male, captured only because an explosion had temporarily incapacitated him. Every other member of the colony had chosen death over capture, a behavior that both frustrated and fascinated Zerak. As the warriors transported the containment unit past him, the human's eyes met his. Zerak felt an involuntary shiver run through his primary nerve cluster. There was something in that gaze, not just defiance, which he had seen countless times before in newly captured specimens, but something else. Something that made his scientific curiosity surge even as his instincts urged caution. Secure him in holding cell Alpha 7, Zerak instructed the warriors. Ensure the environmental controls are calibrated to their homeworld specifications. He had already studied the atmospheric requirements of their species from the colony data. The humans required a precise mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, with trace amounts of other gases, a common combination among carbon-based lifeforms. The warriors acknowledged his order with the traditional gesture of submission, a slight lowering of their combat crests, before proceeding into the facility. Zerak followed at a distance, his mind already racing with the possibilities this specimen represented. The preliminary analysis of their technology had revealed fascinating inconsistencies. Some areas showed remarkable advancement, while others remained surprisingly primitive. Their social structures, too, seemed to defy conventional development patterns. Inside the facility, Zerak made his way to the observation center. Multiple holographic displays showed different angles of the holding cell as the warriors transferred the human from the containment unit. The specimen, designated Subject H1 in the official records, immediately began examining his surroundings once released into the cell. Fascinating, Zerak muttered to himself, watching as the human methodically tested the artificial gravity field, inspected the force barrier, and examined every corner of the cell. This wasn't the behavior of a traumatized capture subject. This was calculated, analytical, almost scientific. The translation team was already at work, processing the linguistic data collected from the colony's communication systems. Zerak had ordered them to prioritize speed over perfection. He needed to establish communication as quickly as possible. The longer a specimen remained in isolation, the more psychological variables could contaminate the study. "Sir," one of his subordinates approached, holding a data crystal, "we've completed the initial analysis of the invasion footage. There's something you need to see." Zerak took the crystal and inserted it into the nearest viewing terminal. The holographic display showed a sequence from the colony's defense. A group of humans, clearly civilians based on their attire, had managed to improvise an explosive device from their laboratory equipment. Instead of using it to attempt escape, they had detonated it while surrounded by Criol warriors, taking themselves and several elite soldiers with them. "Play the audio analysis," Zerak ordered. The sound that came through was a mixture of various human vocalizations, but one phrase repeated several times caught his attention. The translation matrix was still processing it, but the tone was unmistakable. These weren't screams of fear or rage, but something else entirely. They were laughing, his subordinate confirmed. In their final moments, they were laughing. Zerak felt his membrane quiver again, but this time it wasn't from excitement. What kind of species laughs in the face of death? The implications were both disturbing and intriguing. If this was a common trait among their kind, it could explain their unprecedented resistance to capture. He turned his attention back to the holding cell display. The human had finished his inspection and was now sitting on the bed, his posture relaxed but alert. Zerak made a note to adjust the standard psychological evaluation protocols. Traditional methods of breaking a subject's will might prove counterproductive with this species. Begin preparations for the first interview, he instructed his team. I want the translation matrix ready within 3 cycles. And increase the security protocols. Something tells me we're dealing with more than just another primitive species. As his subordinates hurried to comply with his orders, Zerak continued to observe the human. The specimen had started performing what appeared to be physical exercises, another unexpected behavior. Most captured species spent their first cycles in depression or panic. The door to the observation center slid open, admitting a tall figure in the elaborate robes of the Imperial Science Council. Zerak immediately lowered his head in deference. Honored observer, he greeted the council member. We weren't expecting an inspection so soon. The council is very interested in your new acquisition, xenopsychologist Zerak, the observer stated, moving to study the displays. Particularly in light of the unusual resistance encountered during the invasion. Tell me, what are your initial impressions? Zerak chose his words carefully. The specimen displays remarkable psychological resilience and analytical capabilities. Their species appears to have developed several traits that defy standard evolutionary patterns. The most intriguing aspect is their apparent ability to maintain rational behavior while simultaneously exhibiting extreme emotional responses. The observer's primary eyes narrowed. You believe they could be suitable for integration into the Empire? With proper conditioning, yes, Zerak replied, though privately he was less certain. Their technological achievements, while primitive, show potential. And their physical capabilities, combined with their unusual psychological makeup, could make them valuable additions to certain sectors of Imperial service. Or dangerous adversaries if not properly controlled, the observer added pointedly. Zerak inclined his head in acknowledgement. Which is why I've already implemented enhanced security protocols. We will proceed with extreme caution in our evaluation. The observer watched the human for several more moments before speaking again. The council expects regular reports on your progress, xenopsychologist. This species has already cost us more warriors than the last 3 acquisitions combined. We need to understand whether they represent an opportunity, or a threat that needs to be eliminated. After the observer departed, Zerak returned to his study of the human. In all his cycles of xenological research, he had never encountered a species that generated such intense interest from the council so quickly. The pressure to produce results was immense, but he needed to be methodical. One mistake could cost him not just his position, but possibly his life. He activated the communication system. Prepare the interview chamber. We begin as soon as the translation matrix is operational. As he watched his team scramble to comply with his orders, Zerak couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the brink of something unprecedented. Either he was about to make the discovery of his career, or he was about to learn why this seemingly primitive species had managed to resist the mighty Criol Empire with such devastating effectiveness. The human had finished his exercises and was now lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling. But Zerak wasn't fooled by the apparent passivity. Those eyes had shown too much intelligence, too much calculation. The real test would begin once they could communicate. Sir, his assistant interrupted his thoughts, the initial translation matrix will be ready in approximately half a cycle. Zerak nodded, his membranes rippling with anticipation. Good. Let's see what our guest has to say for himself. Little did Zerak know that his carefully planned first contact was about to take a turn that would shake the foundations of his understanding, and potentially, the Empire itself. The language games. James sat on the edge of his bed, counting the rhythmic footsteps of the guards outside his cell. After weeks of captivity, or what he assumed were weeks, he had memorized every pattern of their movements, every shift change, and every subtle difference in their walking styles. The ornately dressed alien, whom he had mentally dubbed the Professor, would be making another appearance soon. The timing was becoming predictable. The memory of his last encounter with the aliens at the research colony still burned fresh in his mind. Dr. Chen's last words echoed in his thoughts, "Remember your training, James. Information is more valuable than compliance." Those words had taken on a whole new meaning now that he found himself as the sole survivor of the colony's massacre. As a xenolinguistics researcher, James had spent years studying theoretical approaches to alien communication. Now, those academic exercises had become a survival strategy. Each time the Professor appeared with its translation attempts, James deployed another layer of his linguistic defense strategy. The familiar sound of lighter footsteps approached his cell. Right on schedule. What is your species capable of? The robotic translation voice echoed through the cell. James suppressed a smile. They were still using the same question, which meant they hadn't realized the pattern in his responses. Time to deploy another language from his arsenal. He had already used Dutch, French, German, Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese. Today, he would try something different. He responded in Russian, deliberately using complex philosophical terminology that would confuse their translation matrix. The question about how their empire dealt with the Fermi paradox would likely be interpreted as gibberish by their systems. The Professor's membrane-covered appendages rippled in what James had learned to recognize as frustration. The alien turned to its subordinates, who cowered slightly at its approach. James had noticed this hierarchy of fear within their society. It seemed to be a fundamental aspect of their culture. Back in the observation center, Zerak was reaching the limits of his patience. How is it possible that every attempt produces a different linguistic pattern? He demanded of his trembling subordinates. Our matrix should be capable of processing any variation of their communication methods. Honored xenopsychologist, one brave assistant ventured, we've analyzed the audio patterns from each interaction. There are consistent elements that suggest these are all structured communication attempts, not random vocalizations. The specimen appears to be using different but equally complex linguistic systems. Zerak's inner membranes pulsed with anger. Are you suggesting this primitive creature is deliberately manipulating our translation efforts? The probability exists, the assistant admitted, immediately lowering his head in submission. The observer from the Imperial Science Council had returned, silently watching the proceedings from the back of the room. Perhaps, the observer interjected, causing everyone to freeze, we are approaching this from the wrong angle, xenopsychologist Zerak. Zerak turned to face the observer, his membranes now quivering with anxiety rather than anger. Please elaborate, honored observer. Your reports indicate that this species achieved global communication despite maintaining multiple linguistic systems. This suggests a level of cognitive flexibility we may have underestimated. The specimen's behavior may be more than simple resistance, it could be a demonstration. Back in his cell, James continued his exercise routine. The physical activity helped him maintain his mental focus and gave him something to do between these linguistic sparring sessions. He had started with basic calisthenics, but now he was incorporating more complex movements, partly to study how the artificial gravity in his cell responded to different types of force application. The nutrient paste they fed him was bland but efficient, he could feel his muscle mass increasing despite the confined space. More importantly, his mind remained sharp, analyzing every interaction, every response, every subtle change in their behavior. He knew he was gambling with his life. Each time he frustrated their translation attempts, he risked pushing them too far. But he also recognized that his value as a specimen was keeping him alive. The more he confused them, the more interested they became in understanding him. The next day brought another visit from the professor, but something was different. Additional observers stood in the background, their ornate robes suggesting higher rank within their hierarchy. "We understand your resistance," the robotic voice stated, trying a new approach. "Cooperation will be rewarded." James switched to Arabic, one of the languages he had studied during his academic years. He responded, discussing how linguistic complexity reflects consciousness complexity. The philosophical nature of his response, combined with the elegant patterns of Arabic script he was mentally translating from, would present their systems with yet another puzzle. The effect was immediate. The observers in the background began gesturing animatedly, their appendages moving in patterns James hadn't seen before. The professor's frustration was now tinged with something else, fear. In the observation center, chaos erupted as the translation matrix produced multiple conflicting interpretations simultaneously. The observer's presence made the situation even more tense. "This is unprecedented," the observer stated, moving closer to the displays. "The specimen appears to be demonstrating mastery over multiple complex communication systems. Our initial assessment of their species' cognitive capabilities may have been severely underestimated." Zerak felt his career balancing on a knife's edge. "Perhaps we should consider more aggressive methods of information extraction," he suggested carefully. The observer's primary eyes fixed on him with alarming intensity. "And risk damaging what may be the most valuable xenological discovery in recent history?" "No, xenopsychologist Zerak. We must understand this. The Council believes this species' linguistic capabilities may indicate other hidden abilities we have yet to discover." Meanwhile, James had begun incorporating mathematical sequences into his exercises. While doing push-ups, he would count in prime numbers, switching languages with each set. He knew their surveillance systems would pick up on these patterns, adding another layer to their confusion. During one of his rest periods, he reflected on the nature of their translation technology. Its ability to quickly adapt to new inputs suggested an AI-based system, but its consistent failure to handle multiple linguistic systems hinted at rigid programming assumptions. This gave him an idea for his next encounter. When the professor returned, James was ready. This time, he responded with a carefully constructed pidgin language, combining elements of multiple Earth languages in a way that would appear structured but be impossible to accurately translate. "HFY thinking that der Unterschied between nos especies est plus grand que vous pensez," he said, deliberately mixing Japanese, English, German, French, and Spanish in a grammatically consistent but linguistically chaotic way. The effect was electric. The professor actually stepped back from the force barrier, its appendages writhing in what appeared to be distress. The observers in the background began documenting frantically on their devices. In the observation center, the translation matrix crashed completely, requiring a full system restart. The observer watched this development with growing interest. "Remarkable," the observer mused. "The specimen has not only identified the limitations of our translation technology but has found a way to exploit them systematically. This suggests an understanding of computational linguistics that should be beyond their technological level." Zerak, seeing his chance to salvage the situation, quickly added, "This could explain their species' rapid advancement to space flight. Their cognitive architecture must be fundamentally different from what we initially assumed." The observer nodded slowly. "The Council will need to re-evaluate our entire approach to this species. Continue your observations, xenopsychologist Zerak, but do not attempt any further direct communication until we have developed new protocols." As the observer departed, Zerak found himself watching the human with a mixture of frustration and newfound respect. The specimen had managed to turn a simple translation exercise into a demonstration of capabilities that were forcing the Empire to reconsider its entire approach to species classification. James, unaware of the profound impact his linguistic games were having on the Empire's scientific community, continued his exercises. He had already planned his next several responses, each designed to push the boundaries of their translation capabilities in new ways. But as he went through his routine, a new thought began to form in his mind. If they were this confused by different languages, how would they handle the true complexity of human communication, idioms, metaphors, cultural references, and the subtle art of sarcasm? A slight smile played across his face as he began planning the next phase of his resistance. The guards outside his cell noticed the smile and shifted uncomfortably. They had learned to be wary of the human's expressions. They often preceded another demonstration that would send the research team into disarray. Little did they know, James was just getting started. The real games were about to begin. Understanding the enemy. The Imperial Science Council's chamber hummed with tension as Zerak presented his latest findings. The massive holographic displays showed multiple analyses of the human specimen's behaviors, including physical patterns, sleep cycles, and the increasingly complex linguistic responses that had thrown the Empire's best translation systems into chaos. Honored council members, Zerak began, his membranes carefully controlled to show appropriate deference. What we initially classified as primitive resistance has revealed itself to be something far more sophisticated. The human specimen appears to be conducting his own study of our capabilities while systematically undermining our attempts to study his. The council chamber erupted in murmurs, their membrane colors shifting through various shades of concern and disbelief. The High Observer, who had been watching the proceedings with particular interest, raised an appendage for silence. "Explain further," xenopsychologist Zerak, the High Observer commanded. "How can a specimen from a pre-imperial civilization conduct a study while in captivity?" Zerak activated a new holographic sequence. "Observe these patterns. The specimen's exercise routines are not random physical activities, they're carefully designed experiments testing our artificial gravity systems. His linguistic responses aren't mere obstruction, they're probing the limitations of our translation technology. Even his sleep cycles appear to be deliberately irregular, preventing us from establishing baseline behavioral patterns." In his cell, James was currently engaged in what appeared to be meditation, but his mind was racing. He had noticed a pattern in the facility's power fluctuations, subtle variations in the force barrier's opacity that corresponded with his more demanding physical activities. Each new piece of information was another tool in his growing arsenal. The nutrient paste they fed him had also become a source of intelligence. Its composition changed slightly every few days, suggesting they were analyzing his metabolic responses. He had begun alternating between eating everything and leaving carefully measured amounts, introducing variables into their data that would make analysis more difficult. The most concerning development, Zerak continued in the council chamber, is the specimen's apparent ability to influence our own research protocols. Watch this sequence. The holographic display showed a series of interactions where James's responses had led to multiple adjustments in their approach, each adjustment seemingly anticipated and countered before it could yield results. "He is weaponizing our scientific method against us," one council member observed, their membranes pulsing with agitation. "Each failure to understand him becomes data he can use to understand us better." Back in the research facility, James had begun his next phase of resistance. When the professor appeared for another attempt at communication, James was ready. "What is your species capable of?" came the familiar translated question. James responded with what appeared to be a coherent sentence in English, but was actually a carefully constructed sequence of technical jargon from multiple scientific fields. The quantum eigenstate of cognitive disambiguation requires recursive paradigm shifts in the mimetic substrate of cross-cultural syntactic frameworks. The sentence was grammatically perfect but semantically nonsensical, designed to force their translation system to process increasingly complex layers of meaning without ever reaching a coherent interpretation. In the observation center, alarms blared as the translation matrix attempted to process the response. The system's quantum processors, trying to establish semantic relationships between the terms, began generating cascading errors that rippled through the facility's connected systems. "Shut it down," Zerak commanded, watching as the facility's primary systems began to show strain from the processing load. "Isolate the translation matrix from the main network." But the damage was already done. The humans' response had triggered a security protocol that none of them had anticipated. By generating what the system identified as potentially dangerous cognitive patterns, James had inadvertently caused the facility's defense systems to activate their highest security protocols. The High Observer, watching through a secure feed, leaned forward with intense interest. "This specimen has managed to create a security breach without access to any of our technology, using nothing but carefully chosen words. The implications are disturbing." In his cell, James noticed the subtle changes in the facility's operation, the slight dimming of lights, the barely perceptible change in air circulation. He had suspected their translation system would be integrated with other facility operations, but the extent of the integration was surprising. This was valuable information. Zerak, struggling to maintain his position and possibly his life, tried to redirect the Council's concerns. This demonstrates the potential value of understanding their species. If one specimen can achieve this much with such limited resources, imagine what we could gain by properly studying and integrating them into the Empire. Or imagine the damage they could do if not properly contained, another Council member countered. "We have never encountered a species that could turn our own systems against us so effectively without any access to technology." The High Observer raised an appendage again, silencing the debate. "Perhaps we have been approaching this incorrectly from the beginning. Xenopsychologist Zerak, you have focused on what the specimen is saying, but what if the true message is in what he is making us do?" This insight sent ripples through the Council chamber. The human specimen wasn't just resisting interrogation, he was conducting an elaborate experiment with the entire facility as his laboratory and the Criol themselves as his subjects. In his cell, James had begun a new exercise routine, this one incorporating elements of Tai Chi. The slow, deliberate movements served multiple purposes, maintaining his physical condition, centering his mind, and most importantly, giving him an excuse to systematically test every cubic centimeter of his cell's environmental systems. He had noticed that the aliens seemed particularly disturbed by smooth, controlled movements. Their own physicality was more abrupt and segmented, suggesting fundamental differences in how their nervous systems processed motion. This, too, was useful information. The facility's medical monitoring systems were registering increasing concerns about the specimen's physiological readings. According to their baseline data, his vital signs suggested he should be experiencing extreme stress, yet his behavior indicated precisely controlled calmness. Either their understanding of human biology was fundamentally flawed, or the specimen was demonstrating unprecedented control over his autonomous systems. "There is another possibility we must consider," one of the more senior council members suggested, their membranes shifting to a deep shade of concern. "What if this specimen is not exceptional among his kind? What if these capabilities are standard for their species?" The implications of this question sent shockwaves through the council chamber. If one human could cause this much disruption while in captivity, what could an organized group of them do? The footage from the colony attack took on new significance. The humans' resistance wasn't just fierce, it was strategically coordinated in ways they were only now beginning to understand. Zerak, seeing both danger and opportunity in this line of thinking, quickly spoke up. "This supports my original assessment. Their species has developed along paths we haven't encountered before. Their apparent primitiveness might be masking capabilities we haven't yet identified." The High Observer's appendages moved in a pattern that signaled deep contemplation. The Council must revise its entire approach to this species. Xenopsychologist Zerak, you will continue your study, but with new protocols. We must assume that everything the specimen does is potentially part of a larger pattern we have yet to recognize. As the council session concluded, Zerak hurried back to his facility, his mind racing with new theories and approaches. But as he approached the human cell, he found himself hesitating for the first time in his career. The specimen was still performing his slow, deliberate movements, but now Zerak saw them differently. Was he observing a captive subject, or was he himself being studied by a consciousness far more sophisticated than they had imagined? James completed another set of movements, allowing himself a small smile. He had no way of knowing the exact effect his actions were having on his captors, but he could sense their growing uncertainty. In the battle of minds that was unfolding, uncertainty was a weapon more powerful than any technology. The real question was, how would they adapt to this realization, and what would it reveal about their own capabilities and limitations? James was patient. Each response from his captors was another piece of data, another step toward understanding the species that had attacked his home. And understanding, as every good scientist knew, was the first step toward victory. The breaking point. The emergency meeting of the Imperial Science Council was interrupted by a cascade of alerts from Zerak's research facility. The holographic displays showed multiple systems failing simultaneously, each failure triggering new security protocols that only seemed to make the situation worse. At the center of this chaos was a single human, still calmly performing his exercises in his cell. "Explain this," the High Observer demanded, all four primary eyes fixed on Zerak. "How has the specimen gained access to our systems?" Zerak's membranes rippled with distress as he attempted to maintain his composure. "Honored High Observer, the specimen hasn't gained direct access to any systems. Rather, he has influenced them through a series of calculated behavioral patterns that our security protocols are interpreting as potential threats." In his cell, James had discovered something fascinating about the facility's automated systems. They responded not just to physical actions, but to patterns of behavior that suggested potential security risks. By carefully choreographing his movements and responses, he could trigger cascading reactions in their security grid without ever touching their technology. The previous day's discovery had been particularly interesting. During one of his Tai Chi routines, he had incorporated a series of movements that mimicked the guard's patrol patterns. The facility's security systems, detecting what they interpreted as unauthorized guard behavior, had initiated a Level 2 security response. The resulting chaos had provided James with valuable insights into their emergency protocols. "Watch this sequence," Zerak said, highlighting a particular section of surveillance footage. "The specimen appears to be performing simple physical exercises, but observe the precise timing and positioning of each movement." The council watched as James executed a series of seemingly innocent stretches that just happened to mirror the facility's standard emergency response patterns. Each movement triggered subtle adjustments in the security systems, creating a feedback loop that forced the facility's AI to constantly recalibrate its threat assessment protocols. "He's not just testing our systems," one council member realized, their membranes paling. "He's teaching them to question their own parameters." The High Observer's appendages twitched in a pattern that indicated severe concern. "This goes beyond mere resistance or scientific curiosity. The specimen is systematically deconstructing our security architecture without ever engaging it directly." In the research facility, James had begun the next phase of his plan. When the professor appeared for another attempt at communication, he was ready with a new approach. "What is your species capable of?" came the familiar translated question. This time, James responded with a carefully constructed series of gestures while speaking, each movement designed to trigger specific responses in their monitoring systems. His verbal response was equally calculated. The recursive nature of consciousness requires a meta-analytical framework that transcends traditional paradigms of communication. The sentence was deliberately constructed to force their translation matrix to attempt increasingly complex semantic relationships, while his gestures triggered corresponding security protocols. The combination created a cascade of systems trying to reconcile conflicting data streams. In the observation center, Zerak watched in horror as the facility's primary systems began to show signs of strain. The translation matrix, attempting to process both the verbal and physical inputs simultaneously, was forcing other systems to reallocate resources to handle the processing load. The specimen has weaponized our own curiosity against us, Zerak realized, watching as his years of careful research began to unravel. Every attempt we make to understand him gives him more information about how to manipulate our systems. The High Observer's response was immediate and severe. This specimen represents a level of threat we have not encountered before. Traditional containment protocols are clearly insufficient. But before any new orders could be issued, something unprecedented occurred. The facility's main AI, struggling to process the conflicting data streams generated by James's activities, began to exhibit signs of what could only be described as uncertainty. Security protocols that were designed to be absolute started generating probability-based responses instead of binary ones. "Impossible," whispered one of the council members. "The AI is learning to doubt." James, unaware of the exact nature of the chaos he was causing but certain it was having some effect, continued his carefully choreographed performance. Each movement, each word, each carefully timed pause was part of a larger pattern designed to create maximum uncertainty in their systems. The facility's lights flickered as power was redistributed to handle the increasing processing demands. Guard patterns became erratic as the security systems struggled to maintain standard protocols while accounting for new variables they had never been programmed to consider. In the council chamber, the displays showed an alarming transformation taking place. The facility's systems, designed to maintain absolute control through rigid hierarchical protocols, were being forced to adapt to handle situations that defied their basic programming assumptions. "The specimen isn't just resisting our attempts to study him," the High Observer stated, their voice carrying tones of both fear and fascination. "He's forcing our entire system to evolve simply to maintain basic functionality." Zerak, seeing his career and possibly his life hanging by a thread, made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. This demonstrates the extraordinary potential of their species. If one specimen can force our systems to evolve, imagine what we could learn from studying their entire civilization. Or imagine the damage they could do if they ever learned the true extent of their capabilities, countered another council member. This specimen has accomplished more damage through inaction than most species could achieve through direct warfare. The High Observer raised all four primary appendages, a gesture that immediately silenced the chamber. "We face a decision point. Either we terminate this experiment immediately, destroying the specimen and all associated data, or we acknowledge that we are dealing with something far beyond our current understanding." In his cell, James had begun incorporating elements of mathematical sequences into his movements, creating patterns that would appear random to organic observers but would force any watching AI systems to attempt to predict increasingly complex series of events. The facility's systems, already struggling to maintain normal operations while processing his previous activities, began generating error messages at an alarming rate. Security protocols started to conflict with each other as different subsystems reached different conclusions about the threat level his behavior represented. "Look at these readings," Zerak pointed to a particular data stream. "The specimen's neural activities suggest he's operating at a level of cognitive complexity that shouldn't be possible given their species' technological development. Either our understanding of consciousness is fundamentally flawed, or they have developed along paths we never considered possible," the High Observer finished the thought. "Paths that our own evolution and technology have made us blind to." As if to emphasize this point, James suddenly shifted his behavior pattern completely, switching to absolutely still meditation. The abrupt change forced all the facility's prediction algorithms to reset simultaneously, creating a cascade of system-wide recalibrations. The council chamber erupted in chaos as reports began flowing in from other research facilities across the Empire. The behavioral patterns exhibited by the human specimen had been recorded and analyzed by multiple systems, and now those analysis protocols were being shared across the Empire's neural networks, causing similar disruptions wherever they were implemented. "It's spreading," one council member reported in horror. The uncertainty protocols generated by the specimen's behavior are being propagated through our entire research network. The High Observer's membranes shifted to a shade never before seen in the council chamber. We may have already passed the point of containment. The specimen hasn't just forced our systems to evolve, he's created a new paradigm of system behavior that's rewriting our fundamental understanding of consciousness itself. In his cell, James completed another set of carefully calculated movements, allowing himself a small smile. He had no way of knowing the full extent of the chaos he was causing, but he could sense the growing uncertainty in his captor's behavior. Something was changing, and for the first time since his capture, he felt like he might have a real chance at not just survival, but victory. The question was, what would his captors do now that they were beginning to understand the true nature of what they had captured? And more importantly, what would happen when they realized that he was just one example of a species that had evolved to turn uncertainty itself into a weapon? The facility's lights flickered again, and James began his next sequence of movements. The real game was just beginning. The revelation. The imperial palace of the Criol Empire had never witnessed such an unprecedented gathering. The High Council chamber, typically reserved for matters of galactic governance, was now filled with representatives from every major scientific and military institution in the Empire. The reason for this extraordinary assembly sat in a reinforced chamber at the center of the room, a single human specimen whose actions had triggered a cascade of events that threatened to reshape the Empire's understanding of consciousness itself. James stood calmly in the chamber, his posture relaxed but alert. The past few days had seen a dramatic shift in his circumstances. Instead of his cell in the research facility, he had been transported to this grand chamber, though the containment protocols around him seemed even more elaborate than before. The High Observer, flanked by the most senior members of the Imperial Science Council, addressed the assembly. We face a crisis unprecedented in Imperial history. Our attempts to study and contain this specimen have led to the fundamental destabilization of our most advanced systems. The integrity of our computational networks, the foundation of our civilization, is at risk. Zerak, now bearing marks of elevated rank despite his recent failures, stepped forward to present the latest analysis. The specimen's influence extends far beyond simple system disruption. Observe these patterns. The holographic displays showed a complex web of system behaviors spreading across the Empire's neural networks. What had started as localized anomalies in the research facility had evolved into something far more profound. Their artificial intelligence systems were beginning to exhibit signs of true adaptive learning, breaking free from their original programming constraints. The specimen hasn't merely corrupted our systems, Zerak explained, his membranes rippling with a mixture of fear and excitement. He has forced them to evolve. Every attempt to contain or understand his behaviors has led to our systems developing new capabilities we never programmed them to have. James watched the proceedings with careful attention. Though he couldn't understand their language directly, he had learned to read their physical responses well enough to know that something significant was happening. The patterns of light and energy flowing through the chamber suggested they were operating at their highest levels of technological capacity. The High Observer turned to address James directly, the translation system now operating on completely new protocols developed specifically for this interaction. We have spent countless cycles trying to understand what your species is capable of. Now we must ask, was this your intention from the beginning? James considered his response carefully. The time for linguistic games was past, now was the moment for a different kind of truth. Your empire is built on certainty, he replied, speaking slowly and clearly. Your systems, your hierarchies, your very understanding of consciousness, all predicated on absolute control and predictability. But the human mind thrives on uncertainty. We don't just adapt to chaos, we create it, shape it, use it as a tool for growth. The translation matrix, newly evolved through its interactions with James, conveyed not just the words but the deeper implications behind them. The assembly erupted in waves of agitated membrane movements as the full impact of his statement became clear. Impossible, one of the military commanders declared. No species can evolve to weaponize uncertainty itself. And yet, the High Observer countered, we have watched this specimen do exactly that. Without access to any of our technology, without any direct interface with our systems, he has forced our entire computational infrastructure to evolve simply by existing in unpredictable ways. James continued his explanation, each word chosen with scientific precision. Your empire sees consciousness as a hierarchy, a pyramid with absolute control at the top. Humans see it as a network, with each point of chaos creating new possibilities for growth. Your systems couldn't understand us because you were looking for patterns that could be controlled, not patterns that emerge from freedom. The chamber's atmospheric processors struggled to maintain stability as the emotional responses of the assembled Criol created waves of biochemical fluctuations. The implications of James's words were reshaping their understanding of not just humanity, but consciousness itself. Zerak, his scientific curiosity overcoming his fear, addressed the assembly. The specimen's behaviors weren't acts of resistance, they were demonstrations. Every response that appeared random or contradictory was actually showing us the limitations of our own understanding. The High Observer's membranes shifted to a color never before seen in imperial records. The question before us is no longer how to contain this species, but how to survive contact with them. If one isolated specimen can force our systems to evolve beyond their programming, what would interaction with their entire civilization do to our empire? James, sensing the pivotal nature of this moment, decided to demonstrate one final point. He began a series of movements that appeared to be a simple exercise routine but incorporated elements of every guard rotation pattern he had observed, every system response he had triggered, and every security protocol he had mapped during his captivity. The chamber's systems, despite their enhanced protocols, began responding in ways that even their designers couldn't predict. Security fields flickered in complex patterns, environmental controls created localized atmospheric phenomena, and the translation matrix started generating new linguistic structures that bridged the gap between Criol and human modes of thought. Remarkable, whispered one of the senior scientists. He's not just demonstrating his understanding of our systems, he's teaching them to understand him. The High Observer raised all four primary appendages, a gesture that silenced the chamber instantly. We face a choice that will define the future of our empire. We can continue to attempt to dominate this species, knowing that each attempt will only lead to more unpredictable evolution in our systems. Or we can acknowledge that we have encountered something beyond our current understanding, a species that has turned our greatest weapon, absolute control, into their greatest weakness. James completed his demonstration and stood still, waiting. He had shown them everything they needed to understand, that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their physical capabilities, but their ability to thrive in and exploit uncertainty itself. The council chambers erupted in debate, but a new pattern was emerging in their discussions. The words containment and control were being replaced by adaptation and cooperation. The empire that had survived for millennia by imposing order on chaos was being forced to consider a new possibility, that chaos itself might be a form of order they had never understood. The specimen has given us a choice, the High Observer announced finally. We can remain an empire that controls through force and dies through stagnation, or we can become something new, an empire that learns to harness uncertainty itself as a force for evolution. James allowed himself a small smile. They were beginning to understand, not just what humans were capable of, but what they themselves might become if they learned to embrace uncertainty rather than fear it. The High Observer approached James's chamber, its membranes now showing colors that reflected both fear and hope. Your species has accomplished something no other has managed in the history of our empire. You have forced us to question not just our methods, but our very understanding of consciousness and evolution. The translation matrix, now operating on principles that merged Criol precision with human adaptability, conveyed James's response with perfect clarity. That's what humans do best. We don't just survive chaos, we create it, shape it, and use it to force evolution. Every human is a catalyst for change, whether they realize it or not. As the assembly digested these words, a new reality began to take shape. The empire that had ruled through absolute control for countless generations was being forced to evolve, not through warfare or technology, but through the simple demonstration that consciousness itself was far more complex and adaptable than they had ever imagined. And in his chamber, James stood calmly, knowing that he had accomplished something far greater than escape or victory. He had shown an empire of absolute control that the greatest power in the universe wasn't the ability to impose order, but the ability to thrive in its absence. The warrior who shocked the galaxy hadn't fired a single shot or launched a single attack. He had simply shown them a truth they had never considered, that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the ability to control chaos, but the ability to become it. The future of both species would never be the same.